Hello and welcome to the latest, in fact, the last talk in this term's series of Mansfield Public Talks. We are moving from Baroness Hale talking about law on last Friday and William Hague talking about democracy in the next 20 years and huge social scientific concerns, and this week back to art and literature. And that's a journey which our speaker this week, Rishi Dastidar, has also made. The most important thing you need to know about Rishi is that he studied modern history at Mansfield College, Oxford, in 1996, without which he would undoubtedly not be the man he is today. But what's happened to him since then is that he's gone on a journey from social science and dabbling in media roles and media regulation to becoming a very successful branding consultant with Brandpie, and in his not so spare time, even more successful poet. And he is the author of these beautiful books, Ticker Tape and Saffron Jack. But he also is extraordinarily generous with his time in helping other people create and write. And he's a member of Malika's Poetry Kitchen. He's a member of a writer development organisation in London called Spread the Word, and also the editor of a book recently published by Nine Arches Press called The Craft, a guide to making poetry happen in the 21st century. At Mansfield, we're very keen on making poetry happen in the 21st century. We have a writer in residence, we have poetry workshops. We're always keen to hear ideas about this, especially from such a distinguished poet as Rishi. So Rishi, we're looking forward to your talk. If you want to ask Rishi questions, you can use the Q&A box and I'll try and curate them that way, I think, given the number of people on the call. So keep them coming whenever they occur to you. And when Rishi's finished his introduction, whatever it's going to be, and then I'll try and take some questions for him. So thank you very much, Rishi. We really appreciate having you here this evening.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Helen, for that introduction. And I am almost blushing as much as the red jumper that I'm wearing tonight in honor of coming back. So thank you, everyone, and good evening. And thank you for giving up some of your Friday night to spend it with me. And thank you again, Helen, for the invitation to come back to Mansfield virtually for now and hopefully in real life as soon as possible. And as Helen mentioned, we'll have questions later and hopefully I'll give you plenty of inspiration for those as I go along. Now, I had a very happy 3 years in college. Yeah, 1996 is slightly more decades ago now than I care to remember. And Mansfield really was a home from home for me, something that I cherished, especially as I arrived fresh from comprehensive. And so I've been delighted to watch from afar as Mansfield has grown in stature and reputation and continue to welcome state school kids like me. And it's just been a really lovely, lovely thing to see. Now, as Helen mentioned, I studied modern history. I ended up specialising in 18th century culture and politics. So it's a little bit of a shaming confession to say that I didn't really know that back then such a thing as contemporary poetry existed. So everything I've learned about it has been after I left college. I actually had my Damascene moment in the Big Borders on Oxford Street in London, which shows you how long ago it was now that there was such a big bookshop there. And I discovered a book called Ashes for Breakfast by the great German poet Ders Grünbein. I picked it up because of the title. Yes, I am that shallow. And I was transfixed by the lines themselves and also the fact that this was modern writing where the lines didn't go all the way to the end of the page. And why had no one told me that you can actually do that with words now? And I really was hooked. I was just absolutely hooked by what I read. In the 15 years since that moment, I've had 2 of my own collections published and edited a book of essays about poetic craft in the 21st century called, with a heap of imagination on my part, The Craft. But before I take us into what I think is helping to make poetry happen today, I'd like to get us in the mood with a poem, Digging by Seamus Heaney. I'll explain why in a moment. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound. When the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away. Stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep, to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf. Digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge, through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. It's great, isn't it? If you're hearing that for the first time, I hope that sits well with you. It was the poem that made Heaney into famous Seamus. I love it for the shift that he dramatizes in the life he's about to live, from spade to pen. And I suspect that when we think about poetry in the 21st century, we can be so gripped by ideas of novelty. We forget that even though the pen might now be a phone, we still need to dig even as, especially as, we click. Heaney, in the Redress of Poetry, he's collected Oxford lectures from when he was a professor of poetry, refers to W.H. Auden's trinity of poetic faculties, making, judging, and knowing. Let's focus on making. How might that change for poetry through and thanks to digital technologies? I think there are three aspects to any answer. One, that making poetry happen in the 21st century needs community. Digital technology facilitates this. Two, that the technology also allows for a whole range of new voices to emerge as poets, people who might have otherwise previously found it hard to enter this world. And three, we need poetry to happen because it provides the connections, metaphors, and language that we need to understand and perhaps even change the world. But before I dive into the first of those aspects, it's probably wise if I define terms. What do I actually mean when I say poetry? So I could say speech placed under pressure to make it musical, which does sound a bit pretentious, I admit. I could say, borrowing from the poet Don Patterson, that a poem is just a little machine for remembering itself. However, the definition I prefer is poetry as something that takes a specific memory, moment, experience, or thought you or a persona might have had and makes it universal, so that someone separate from you in space and time says, how could that person know that I felt and feeling something similar? And then does that in a language that is at once instantly familiar and entirely new. So my students' faces fall when I tell them this, as they realise the implication that perhaps writing poetry is going to be harder than they thought, which is why I should stress that this is not the only definition of poetry available, and we can discuss what yours might be later. Now, knowing what poetry might be and the writing of it isn't actually the most important part of being a poet. Rather, it's your commitment to the wider art form and the community you're part of. I've been fortunate in learning how to write under the tutelage of some of the best and most inspiring poets working in the UK. Claire Pollard, Pascal Petit, Joe Shapcott, Daljit Nagra. More than technique though, what I learned from them is about being an artist. What it takes to be fiercely committed to your work, to push boundaries, to being part of the poetry community singular and the many smaller groupings within it. Those are important lessons that I try to live up to, even if I fail a lot of the time. Online is where a lot of these communities gather now. Now, this was happening before the pandemic, of course, but poetry, especially the sharing of it with others in the moment, as something that occurs mostly in classrooms and rooms above pubs, small gatherings of the committed, well, that was in rude health until the virus struck. Now Zoom is our room in the pub, and there are good and bad things to this. A big plus has been the increased accessibility. It has been shaming to discover how little so many of us thought about how hard some people might find it to get up the stairs to the room itself, how tricky others might find it to hear the poems when they arrived. Now, with enough allowances and preparation, online platforms can reduce those barriers, so more people who want to be in these communities can be. On the downside, I think we're yet to work out what delivering words down a web camera might mean for both how we perform the poems and their impact on our listeners. I suspect I'm not the only one who comes to a reading with a slight sense of weariness after a day on Zoom. And now more Zoom, but with poems. Sort of like now, in fact. That said, I generally feel refreshed after hearing poems in this in-between space. But I can't help but worry that we're losing something with words heard down Wi-Fi rather than in the same shared air. But I don't know what. The vigour and vitality of the variety of various poetry communities has undoubtedly been fueled by social media too. Making connections and finding like minds is easier now. Poetry Twitter, and there is such a thing, most days is a happy place, full of work being shared, encouragement given, excitement generated as people find new voices, revel in the wonder that is this curious thing we write and read. Poetry podcasts such as The Poetry Exchange, A Poem a Day, and Frank Skinner's Reader's Guide are booming, introducing and celebrating all forms and types of poems. But then, the latent Eeyore in me pipes up. Are we getting the stillness and quietness we need to read and write, to dig, if we are too immersed in the digital world? Do we have to relearn being comfortable with being offline for longer periods to allow the poems to flow? And when I say we, do I really mean me? I suspect I can't be the only poet who has plunged into a life online and is only starting to work out what that means for my poetry life. Now, what the digital world has led to is a whole range of new voices to emerge as poets, people who might have otherwise previously found it hard to be acknowledged within the art form. And these new voices are also starting to show us new ways to write, new subjects to explore, perhaps even new ways to be poets. The most obvious and high-profile example of digital technology's impact on poetry is that of Insta Poetry. For those of you who don't know what Insta Poetry is, think often very straightforward words, presented maybe with some visual adornment or shown in a font that reminds you of a typewriter, then shared on Instagram. It's not so much poem and image, but more poem as image, a complete package of something that might be truth. Rupi Kaur is the name most associated with Insta Poetry, a publishing sensation who has moved from social media fame to being a genuine bestseller. Now, every 18 months or so, a piece will be published decrying Insta Poetry for, well, take your pick. It's not poetry. It's not good poetry. People shouldn't be reading or writing this type of poetry. They should be reading or writing other poetry. Insta Poetry sells far too much. It's too simple, too easy to understand. The pictures devalue it. And these in turn then lead to defenses of Insta Poetry, many of which I agree with as it happens, that it's not as bad as all that it's a way for voices previously marginalized within mainstream poetry publishing to find a readership. That if it means that people who might not otherwise discover contemporary poetry discover contemporary poetry, then that is all to the good rather than indicating the return of barbarism. What's interesting to me is that in poetry, we sometimes find it hard to openly say that we're talking about taste. The term often the term craft is used as a smokescreen for this. That poem is not crafted well, as code for, I don't like the simplicity with which that poem achieves its effects. There is also the issue of popularity, and many critiques of Insta Poetry and those writers who have emerged through social media more generally can be summed up as, they sell well, so they must be a bit suspect artistically. Now, forgive the lurch into commerce, but I want as many people as possible reading poetry, not just academically, but for their pleasure, in their leisure time. Here's an imperfect parallel. I suspect most of you listening tonight feel that as participants in the literary community, you should at least know and hopefully read the Booker Prize winner each year. I want you all to feel something similar towards the winners of the Forward Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prizes each year. They generally will be as brilliant reads as those lauded novels, and whisper it, shorter too. Now, one reason why I think poetry has seen an uptick, certainly over the last 10 years, not just of sales, but increasing presence in our cultural conversation, is precisely its power to help us explain and navigate the uncertainty that digital technologies bring to how we feel. If you accept that we are all multitudes, to weave in some Whitman there, then we are all living this truth every day. The me on Twitter is more whimsical than the cat dad me that is on Instagram, the old school friend me that is on Facebook, the work colleague me that is on Slack. And I think through being on these platforms, people are starting to grasp what poets know instinctively, or at least discover, that a single person can be many different capital I's at many different times in many different spaces. So why not engage with the art that has this probing of self, of selves at its core? Here's a hostage to fortune. There is no more pleasurable way of self-examination than poetry. And I stress mostly joking when I say it is cheaper than therapy. And many eyes mean that it is natural to see that many poets have been writing in response to, even in some sense shaping, a rise in awareness of the different identities all of us have to carry through the different spaces we pass through. I'm going to skip past any significant discussion of identity politics and political poetry, except to observe that it might have been better if Shelley had said poets should be interrogators rather than unacknowledged legislators, interrogators of the language that power is couched and used in. How might we achieve those interrogations, or rather conversations? American poet Claudia Rankine, through her American lyrics, has shown us a way. Her use of a technique called the lyric essay, a poetic form that combines the ability of the lyric to reach beyond the surface of the I, and the essay to weigh up arguments, means she can use something that appears prose-like to communicate nuance and difficulty in discussions, which should be nuanced and difficult. something which the blunderbuss of prose argument can struggle with. While it might not be technologically driven per se, I think of the lyric essay as a very 21st century form precisely because it is reflexive and helps us understand the texture of how we live now. And of course, for poets, social media platforms and spaces have allowed a greater degree of control over how they are presented and how they want to be seen than ever before. This has been of vital importance in bringing previously underrepresented voices, especially those of writers of colour, into poetry communities. Consider a poet like Warsan Shire, whose work first appeared on Instagram and Tumblr. Its brilliant insights into pain, longing and loss, especially when displaced from your homeland, might well have been suited for a traditional route into publishing. But by holding back from this, acclaim for her aesthetic has only grown, and she has been able, and it sounds odd to say it of someone who is probably one of the most famous poets in the world right now, at least online, to cultivate a rock star-like air of mystery, which is why then it was fitting that she collaborated with Beyonce on the latter's Lemonade visual album a couple of years ago. And that the creation of images is much more accessible too means that we're seeing the emergence of poets who are as much visual artists as writers. Helen and I were just sort of discussing this before we came on, but my book of this year is Poor by Caleb Femi, who I know has occupied this slot last year. And he's a wonderful writer, wonderful poet, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book, and I urge you all to rush out and get it. And part of its power and his power is the way that he finds verbal and visual images from the lives of young Black men that are as graceful as they are unflinching. And the book is studded with his photographs as well as his poems, and it's a wonderfully powerful reading experience. Now, what of the new ways to write that I hinted at earlier? What approaches to writing poetry do digital technologies allow for? At one level, it is as simple as there being new mediums to use. Take the humble out-of-office email message. We've all, I hope, switched that on when heading off on holiday, a short line saying that we won't be checking inboxes. But, and this is a challenge that I offer out, what if you put a poem in that channel instead? It's something I used to do, and I must confess I've got a little scared of doing it since I switched agency a couple of years ago. But if you have to tell colleagues you are away, why not do it differently? And hopefully raise a smile and possibly indicate a sense of smugness too. Naturally, digital tools are having an impact on how poets write too. Inua Ellams, the great playwright and poet, his new book is called The Actual, and it's excellent. And that was written entirely on the Notes app on his iPhone. So before he was going to sleep, waking up first thing, on the run to and from meetings. And this working methodology, tapping as he goes, has an impact, an obvious impact on the page too. The poems there are square, they're taut, they're staccato, and they feel like the app in which they were created. Predictive Text is another tool open for use. Australian poet Jill Jones used it recently, entering random words from Gertrude Stein's How to Write into a smartphone, then making use of the Oulipo N+7 technique to create a work called How to Write or How Not to. I try some more, a veritable hope. Can I still do this? Hours follow. The poem says at one point, hinting at a limitation. Digital technology makes procedural experiments in writing poetry much easier to accomplish. And so it becomes harder to know when to stop and call the work done, abandon. And that leads to one other thought that I'd like to plant, that we should be more open to the idea that what the poetry of the 21st century is really closer to is the sampling and remixing that is part of making modern pop music. The American artist and writer Kenneth Goldsmith talked about this in his 2013 manifesto, Uncreative Writing, that the job of the poet now is not about making it new, but rather finding ways through the torrents of information we are immersed in and reframing it, representing it, becoming machines more concerned with finding meaning in what has already been created, rather than mere word artisans. And this might be important as we're not too far away from computers being competent enough to write poems for us. This year, OpenAI, one of the bodies promoting the use of artificial intelligence, launched GPT-3, a language learning model that produces text that feels eerily like it has been written by a human. Now, it's not quite left behind the corpus of text that it has learnt from, but for many people not au fait with contemporary poetry, they might be hard pressed to tell the difference. Is it poetry if no emotion has been involved in its creation? I'm not sure, but then I'm also not sure that AI written poetry will ever get beyond a parlor trick. It's hard to imagine phalanxes of computers being deployed to write poetry at scale, although maybe out there tonight there is someone with entrepreneurial bent who is thinking of doing precisely that. However poetry is created in the future, through a bardic AI or humans gesturing at virtual reality writing desks, we need it to happen and to continue happening, because it is poetry that provides the connections, metaphors, and language that we need to understand and even change the world. Why is this important? Go back to my point about interrogation of the language of power. How we frame the world, how we understand the words used to describe relationships between people, capital, and other resources are the starting point for being able to change those relationships. So we have to be able to A, get good at seeing metaphors, and B, get better at creating new ones. I mean, we're participating in a giant metaphor right now, the cloud. The very fact that I can speak to you tonight via Zoom is because of the cloud. But the cloud is not a cloud. Rather, it is an array of space rented by Zoom on various computer servers, mostly owned by Amazon, located around the world. And as much as the metaphor renders something graspable about the rapidity with which bits of information come together and assemble in patterns we recognize, it also hides. Because the metaphor says nothing of the environmental impact that these servers have, how electricity hungry they are, how much heat and carbon dioxide they give off. Trying to find new ways to explain, highlight, and understand, and then begin to change how we are living on the planet by illuminating and making us all think differently is, to my mind, going to be a crucial part of successfully slowing, maybe even reversing climate change. We need to find a language beyond what we have now that helps to galvanize action and shift minds and hearts. And I firmly believe that poetry cannot stand aside from this, indeed should be leading the process. Finding metaphors as vivid and simple as the cloud, but that encourage humanity to change our behavior collectively. And through metaphor comes connection. The one thing, and I'm sure we could argue about this after, the one thing that does feel new about poetry in the 21st century is the fact that poems go viral now. Those ones that do in some way connect deeply, viscerally, unexpectedly. Maggie Smith's Good Bones, Japanese Maple by Clive James, Kim Adonzio's To the Woman Crying Uncontrollably in the Next Stall. I'm pretty sure you've seen at least one of these. I've seen all of them race across timelines, shared with urgency, intent, and kindness. Look, the sharer says, even in this concise digital space we share, the world, our world, can be made bigger, and perhaps through that, better. So hopefully I have persuaded you that digital technology in poetry has led to more active and inclusive communities, new voices coming through, new approaches to making work, and the need for new connections and new metaphors. But, of course, in amongst the willingness to try new things that I think poets need to have to thrive right now, some things stay the same. To write poems well, you still need those core craft skills. You need to learn your forms, separate your sonnets from your sestinas. You need to learn the rules in order to break them. And these constraints can be pleasurable inspiration too. As Paul Muldoon puts it, form is a straitjacket in the way that a straitjacket was a straitjacket for Houdini. You need to be brave. Know that, as Forward Prize winner Caroline Bird says, getting lost as you write and not knowing where you're going is fine. More than fine, in fact. To quote her, writing a poem is impossible. And when you realize this, you're free. And maybe this is the obsessive in me speaking now, but a willingness to be obsessed by poems and poetry is no bad thing either. My Nine Arches stablemate Gregory Ledbetter says, poetry has designs on our very being. Let's be willing to give in to this design. The US-based poet Chen Chen puts it this way, and I'm tempted to turn this into a t-shirt, maybe even a tattoo. I am a poet because I ask poetry to do too much, and then it does it. And that, to me, sounds like a good summary of what the 21st century needs. So, keep clicking and keep digging. Thank you very much.
Well, Rishi, one thing we can't do on Zoom is clap, but that was amazing. Thank you very much. Really incredible. And I'm going to be covered in tattoos if I although you wrote you had there. They're fantastic. I absolutely love the straitjacket for Houdini. That sums it up for me. So anyone who wants to ask some questions, please do. I've got one here, or it's a kind of comment come observation come question, but it's a thoughtful one that says, reflecting on what you said about how Zoom mediates or moderates poetry, do you think it, and in your phrase, that when you're live, we share the same air? Poetry is sonic and kind of performative in the moment, and you can hear that pin drop or the moment when somebody actually, you know, has a little intake of breath. But on Zoom, you kind of hear that, but you only have the head and the shoulders communicating it. So is it like listening with no bass or the volume low, or is it just different?
Well, yeah, at one level it is absolutely just different. And yeah, I think, yeah, we're starting from a point where it is better than nothing. It is much better than nothing. It's much better to be able to see faces, whatever. But I think there is, yeah, not to try and get too mystical about it, there is something about the real life transmission of something that is only mediated by air, as opposed to going down, you know, through wires and all the rest of it. And at one level, that can be that technical thing around the delay and, you know, other things that you have there. But I think, you know, if you think that we're only sort of really, what, 9 months into people really starting to get to grips with how to use it properly, and I mean that almost utilitarianly, in terms of it's a common thing where often lots of people feel that poets, you know, lots of poets don't know how to read, perform their work properly, or don't necessarily know how to fully inhabit the space. And, you know, learning that sort of aspect of stagecraft takes time. Learning how to do a reading, attack a reading, be confident in the work and own that. You know, we almost have to relearn those skills for this smaller box, and being able to project in a different way down the line, and, you know, and all those sorts of things. And, you know, I do by no stretch of the imagination claim to be an expert at it, or necessarily even feel all that confident in doing it. But I think, you know, for working poets especially, that's something that you probably need to start sort of grappling with, in terms of how do I make the most of this square little box that I'm going to be in for until the vaccine arrives, and how do I make sure that the intent behind the poem really comes across in that way as well, which you might be more able to grasp if we were all together in the same room.
Yeah, a bit like a confessional, isn't it? Just
Yes.
little tiny bits.
Precisely.
It's going to be, I mean, it is going to be interesting when people, I've met you several times on Zoom, talked about several different things, but it's going to be strange to meet you in real life, never having actually met you, and I've seen you and talked about things. But yeah, I mean, it is just a really interesting and different way of interacting, isn't it? Somebody's asked about what you can do to get yourself to write every day and to get yourself off the drag to the page, and comments on maybe YouTube and Twitter and WhatsApp being a surprise and a spark. But then he's added afterwards, on a few minutes later, he's thought again and then said, yes, but I'm a bit suspicious about the intellectualization of poetry now, and we don't really need that. I need a language and a sense of feeling, and I'm not going to have to live up to the greats if I'm not famous Seamus or Shelley, forget it. So how do you, it's a trick, isn't it, not to be intimidated by the...
Yeah, precisely that. But I think we can separate some of those things out. That first point in terms of finding inspiration from anywhere, especially online, yeah, absolutely, because that is broadly where I start. I mean, I feel like I stick out in terms of UK contemporary poetry, in terms of what I write and how I write, because I'm so focused and inspired by what goes on with language that sort of flashes across the screen, whether it's Twitter, whether it's WhatsApp, and all those sorts of things. And there are always phrases that just sort of start to leap out. And I tend to fall into this. The American poet Mary Ruefle, she, in Madness, Rack and Honey, her wonderful book of essays, she talks about how lots of poets can post-rationalize and pretend that, yes, I intended to write this poem about XYZ subject, but actually the real moment of creation is a piece of language that snacks, that captures you in some way and that you can't shake. And it might describe something, obviously it might be a piece of nonsense, but that's the thing that you start turning around and working with, and discovering where it takes you. And that, for me, often more over than not, comes from something that's a piece of text that's flashed across the screen. And what you do with it then is your practice, your process. You note it down, you file it away, you come back to it, you work on it, whatever. And my process tends to be that there are some poems where I will seize that and almost instinctively know where I want to go with it. And a first draft emerges in about 10-15 minutes, and then you work on it, and I sort of leave it after about 6-7 drafts, and then come back to it in 6-8 weeks and say, well, does that make any sense? And there are others where, okay, that phrase is interesting, and it goes into a notebook, and then I look at it in a year's time and go, what the hell was I thinking there? But there's something to go off, there's something to work with, and you always need to be alert and alive to that. And I tell students a lot, don't worry if you're not writing, worry if you're not observing, worrying if you're not noticing and listening and writing stuff down, because you will always have fallow periods, and that's fine, because you need those fallow periods, but you want to always be gathering stuff. You always want to be gathering stuff. In terms of, but that doesn't therefore necessarily mean that the end product has to be over-intellectualized or feel over-intellectualized. And I always tell people who are coming to contemporary poetry for the first time, maybe have heard something on Radio 4, or maybe have just seen a poem in the Guardian, whatever. Don't worry about trying to decode it. Don't worry about trying to quote unquote understand it. It's not a puzzle set by MI6. Just enjoy it for the sound of it. Just enjoy what the language is doing. Just enjoy what it's starting to do to your brain. That's fine. If you want to then go and try and unpick it and decode it and start to work out text, subtext, whatever, fine, that's great. But more often than not, most poets want to be enjoyed at multiple levels. And if you come and tell me, I don't know what the hell you were going on about, but my God, it sounded good, I will shake your hand, because that's perfectly fine for me. And there are plenty of poets and poems out there that you can find that do exactly that and do not demand to be understood more deeply than that. And if you then can find more meaning in there, absolutely. that's brilliant. But do not worry that no one's trying to pull a trick on you, or very few poets are trying to pull a trick on you and say, aha, I've set you up with a puzzle and you haven't solved it. Yeah.
It's interesting what you said about what matters is to go on observing and making the space to observe. There's a question here from someone who says he found your work in a local library and has just joined, so that's great. But I was going to say, when there are a lot of other things going on in your life, and I know you have a lot of other interests in a kind of corporate career out there, branding things, how do you make the space where this stuff cooks? And the person who just asked this question from the library said that he recently deleted all his social media accounts in pursuit of digital minimalism to make room in his brain for more creative work. And then people say, well, how do you get it out there? And how do you be part of a community? But how do you get that balance between the old school, I want to be alone, and I want to be stimulated and be part of something bigger?
So I think multiple ways of thinking and addressing that. You sort of have to find what works for you. And I found, certainly over the last year, 18 months or so, I'm very deliberately trying to make sure that, say, Saturday is a day where I'm nowhere near my laptop and I am checking my phone minimally, if at all. So I am having a Sabbath type day somewhere where it is just, I'm just reading on paper effectively, or just going for a walk, or doing my exercise, or whatever that might be. So taking breaks and steps back from there, absolutely. And I think it is remembering that ultimately you are in control of this stuff. You don't have to be on these platforms. I know that it can feel like, and certainly my proselytizing about them and my and other poets visibility and presence on them can make it feel like, oh god, everyone is there. But of course not everyone is there, and it's perfectly plausible and possible for you as a writer to build a career and build a profile without doing that at all. I think of someone like J.O. Morgan, who's been nominated for Forward and Eliot multiple times, and writes these wonderfully beautiful, lyrical, and yet strange and unsettling poems, and emerges every couple of years with a book and then goes back to the farm in Scotland. And that's perfectly fine and doable as well. I mean, there comes a point where if you've got good enough at writing poems and have become committed enough that publishers start getting interested, that there then is that trade-off of how much do I want to sort of enter into a career type thing, and what are the compromises, challenges that I need to navigate that. But I think that's a separate thing from whether you need it to write, and you don't. But I think if you can keep that differentiation in mind, that creation and writing is separate from publishing and books and magazines and career and all that sort of stuff, then you've generally got it in balance, I think.
Well, I mean, someone else has also asked that you've been talking about the way in which things going online mean that communities can form, and you don't need to have to be in a particular town or be able to get to a particular room in a pub and all those other things. But someone has asked whether you think, and it's an interesting point, that this transition to online communities may have a kind of flattening effect, that you may lose actually a regional flavor, and you may lose, maybe here's what people are writing now, here's what they're saying, here's how they're saying it. And if you don't want to be part of that big national conversation, you lose the smaller and the personal community.
Potentially, yes. But I'd say right now that feels theoretical more than like it's actually going to happen. And I say that because the last 10 years or so especially has actually seen quite a resurgence in poetry that's grounded in local idioms, grounded in local dialects, and starting to bring forth tones and variations that don't look like or feel like standard English, standard Southern London English, whatever. And I think especially, so slightly biased here, but Nine Archers, my publisher, are based in Rugby. That's where Jane, my editor, works. And so she's a great champion for writing that comes from the West Midlands. And and she writes in a way that brings that area to life. Liz Berry is another one of our wonderful poets who has written wonderful poems that are really rooted and grounded and bring forth that specific Black country dialect, and are unafraid to embrace that. And of course, there are plenty of poems and poets writing in Scots now, as well, just as another example. So that is there, and it is happening. And and when you know that, say, something like the Poetry Society, the way that they regionally organize their stanza groups, their local writing groups, chances are that it's less likely that there's going to be that flattening out. I think where the concern of flattening out might be right is then thinking about how actually what gets published, and how do we actually ensure that there is, within what is being published both in books and magazines, that reflection of the variety of different dialects and idioms that are right across the island, the archipelago that we are. And I think that often sometimes gets forgotten, that actually what poetry is does not just center around what London is. And it can sometimes feel that way, especially I say this, the Thames is like 10 minutes walk behind me, so I'm guilty of that sin as much as anything else. But I think that is a thing that does excite me. How do we make sure that we reflect that variety as well? But I don't think I think the danger of it happening in online communities is less, it's more we have to make sure that publishing infrastructures really reflect those voices and bringing those through.
Can I ask you a couple of questions that have come through about your influences? We have one from Ros Ballister, who is both the chair of the English faculty here and an English fellow at Mansfield, but also a rookie poet in our poetry writing group, and love hearing her work. But she's obviously, as you probably know, an 18th century culture specialist and the 18th century theatre specialist, and she's written about, to ask whether you think you learned anything from your 18th century studies about what you know about poetry now. I think who you are.
I think Ros is very perceptive there, because I think I've not that I've read a huge amount of 18th century stuff, but I very unfashionably, for example, do have a really large sweet spot for Pope. And and I know and one of the this is going to sound a really roundabout way of answering this, forgive me, but one of the more trying nights of my life was seeing the David Hare play South Downs a couple of years ago, which is that thinly veiled autobiographical thing about him going to Lansing. But in that there is a massive swipe at Pope, basically, where he says, I hate Pope, I paraphrase slightly, because he's on the side of the court, because he's on the side of power, and there's no challenging or lifting up that that sense of fighting for right or whatever. And I was sort of outraged by that, because I find Pope just really funny and musical, and I love the lightness of touch. And I can't claim the same sort of metrical genius and being locked down on the iambs and all that sort of stuff, but I do love the patterning that's there as well. So I try and bring that through, not necessarily as obviously end rhymed or heroic couplets in that way, but that is lurking in there as well. I must confess though that my bigger influence in that regard is Pushkin. Onegin is a canonical text for me, and actually more than any other form I write in, I write and draft in these Pushkin sonnets. So his very tricksy tetrameter, and this sort of very fleet style. And I discovered it through Vikram Seth's Golden Gate, and I went back to Onegin from there.
Circa 1986. The lived man, his name was John. Yes.
And it's just and I love it. So I generally always have about 3 copies of the Golden Gate in the house, lest and always sending them out to friends and what have you. So so that absolutely, that patterning and that rhythm is there somewhere deep down in my lyric style. And so I am concerned about sound, I am concerned about the tautness of the line. But you see, when you look at my work on the page, I'm not a minimalist at all. I'm very much trying to pack as much into the lyric as possible to see how much I can get away with before it falls over and before it breaks. And a lot of that then has come from Frank O'Hara in particular, Des Grunbein as well, Daljet, Daljet absolutely, of course. I had to go through that period of just writing very sub-Daljet poems before I could actually get past that and get to something that sounded more like me. So and I think certainly Daljet's early work as well does have that sort of springiness and bounce that you might associate with English poetry from the 18th century as well. So Ros, you're absolutely right. It's there. So
you're kind of putting a form around something quite, I mean, in things like Pope, quite political, but someone else has asked, you started off with that extraordinary Heaney poem, and someone else has asked whether you think a poem should enact or even rival a physical experience. And that digging poem is very much like that, isn't it? But
that's a really good and tricky question. It's not so much enact. It's meant to take you there. It's meant to make you, evoking of evocation is in a sense the right word. But I come back to that definition that I used earlier in terms of, the poems that are really great, the poems that last, are the ones that just that give you that flash of recognition. And sometimes that's intellectual, sometimes that is actually physical as well. And of course, if you can do both, you are a genius like Heaney was as well. And I think, I think you're more likely to get it if you're able to translate the physical and the actual into something that, retains its tangibility through the text and through the words. I mean, that's why you often see in poems that aren't working or haven't been fully worked through an abstraction out, often a sort of what feels like a rookie, or a beginner writer, is that sense of seeking words that feel and or considered to be poetic. Another stablemate of Nine Arches, Jo Bell. She has a list of words of about 25 which she deems as to be the poetic words you need to avoid. And things which people lean towards and grasp for that poetic effect, which isn't necessarily earned through the creation of new images and the creation of new language. And actually, when you dig beneath why that is happening, what it is that it's actually abstracting away from the truth of the physical experience or the idea or the memory or the sensation that you want to convey. And that's why I say it's the hardest thing to write, because you're trying to capture all that, but do it in a way that instantly feels familiar, but isn't cliche and new. And when you're trying to reconcile and square all those impossibilities, like, Jesus, come on, I'm just going to go write a screenplay because I can make more money. I mean, why am I doing this to myself otherwise?
I just thought of sort of cod poem that Tony Harrison wrote in one of his plays, a translation of the Misanthrope, which has always haunted me, which finishes up with the couplet, "And all we hopeless lovers share the nightmare of the bathysphere." And you think, please, not that one. Somebody else, we're just talking about these ideas of what a poem is. Maya Little, who studied poetry and other things here and is now working for Torch in Oxford, asks what you think are the uses of defining poetry, because do you have to say it doesn't really matter if it communicates what it's meant to communicate? It's the idea of the thing that I'm trying to do that matters, rather than is it a poem? Or do you think the form matters?
I struggle with this a lot because I often, those if you follow me on Twitter, you'll often see that joking, not joking, I'll often just throw something out, share a link or a story and say, this is a poem. And almost daring people to say then, well, actually, what is the poem in that? Is it the insight? Is it the play of language? Is it the image that's there? Rather than the form itself. An example, obviously, thinking and reading about Maradona this week a lot. And there is a photo of him from the 2018 World Cup, which I absolutely treasure, where he's just almost savior-like, being adored and by the crowd. But the photographer's pulled right out, and so he's got a halo around him while you see the sort of rest of that side of the stadium. And when I first saw that, I just shared it and said, this photo is a poem. And part of me has in the back of my mind, should I write something going off that? But part of me goes, no, that's it. That's conveying something that's so perfect, but it is poetic in the way that it conveys it. And so therefore, why would I add to it? And I think so. So when you look at something like Poor, actually, to go back to Caleb's book, Caleb is doing something similar in that as well. There are points at which his language is so perfectly precise that it evokes something absolutely new in terms of how we think about the lives of these young Black men. But then he does it through the photography that he's done as well, and presents that unadorned as well. And and you can call it art, but there's almost a way he's saying, well, if it's facing a poem, it is actually a poem as well. So once things work at that level, but then ultimately I think you're trying to claim something, however it appears on the page, that almost dares you to go a bit beyond rationality, and that dares you to trust in the emotional leap and the emotional truth that you might find without necessarily knowing how you've got there from A to B to C. And does form help you do that? Sometimes, yeah, absolutely. Don Patterson talks a lot about the idea that, say, rhyme actually forces meaning and helps you discover meaning where you might not have realized that there was a connection there as well. So this is why I'm not strict in terms of saying one is one or one is the other. You want to, as part of your poetic education and your poetic journey, you want all the tools at your disposal, because there will be some ideas that are absolutely perfectly expressed as a sonnet. There will be other ideas that are absolutely perfectly expressed as just one word. And it's trusting your instinct and trusting, knowing what you're writing about, knowing how you're writing, and then being daring with yourself and saying, no, this is it. This is the thing it is, and this is the way it's working.
I'm interested in that, because I know from the essays that you edited in the Craft, you are very interested in diversifying voices, in encouraging people to find their voice, democratizing, but you do call it the craft, and you do think it's important to understand form and to work at craft. And there is someone who's asked a question here, which they've tried to be put in a generous way, if they put it, but they said, isn't there a danger that people think, well, anyone can make it in poetry land? You don't display fine art and anyone who can do a doodle at the same place and say, let's all just come and chat together. You do actually have some hierarchy of what's good art and what happens if you don't do that. And I suppose you can say that about photography too, because everyone's a photographer now. But when you say, well, actually, this is properly crafted art, and this is just self-expression.
So again, it's separating out lots of things. One is intention, and understanding your intention and what you're trying to do takes time. And so that's where the sense of you can't just write something and it's a poem comes from. My operating default, my standard is always learn everything that you can so that you know which ones you want to break. I didn't do a creative writing MA. Instead, I studied with Joe Shapcott and Daljit for at the Faber Academy for a good sort of 6-9 months or so, and that was effectively boot camp. The first term with Joe is indelibly seared on my memory as we went through syllabic counts and iambs and dactyls and boom, boom, boom. So all of that stuff, all that grounding. because you need to understand how the foundations work and how that underwiring works before you can then go and say, right, okay, what do I want to discard now? What do I, what's really working with me? What's really chiming with me? So, and through that process as well, you're then learning how to articulate partly what it is you're doing as well. And poetry is one of those frustrating things where sometimes the work speaks for itself. Other times you have to help gloss and help explain and help expand what it's doing. The other thing as well is time. Joe Bell again talks about the idea that it takes about 10 years to start to get really good at this, in terms of knowing what it is that you want to do, having the control, as we talked about earlier, sort of moving away from grasping for the obvious poetic words and the things that feel like poetry, having read enough and around to know the world, to actually know what you like, what you don't like, how, and then let that help inform how you put your words together. And of course, the thing that winnows people away at that point as well is, of course, that you're doing this for next to nothing, no financial rewards, next to nothing, no wider recognition outside of this sort of band of obsessives. So, so to keep doing it, you have to really be obsessed by it in some sort of way. Because again, right, if you want to put words together to make money, again, write your screenplays, Netflix is hiring, Netflix is hungry, write that screenplay. But there is something about the effect that poems and poetry can have on people, which just keeps drawing people back to it in a way. Very few screenplays change people's lives. Poems do change lives. And I think it's that people come to and want to try and not understand, because you never understand how you do that, but try and get a taste of, maybe I can do that too. But that takes time. Of course, it takes time.
One of the things about trying to curate these conversations online as opposed to in our lecture theatre in Mansfield is that in the lecture theatre in Mansfield, I see a hand and I take my chances, whereas here I'm kind of seeing what's happening. And in the Q&A box, which only I can see, all sorts of people are kind of coming back and answering and having conversations. It's such a shame they can't come and have these conversations with you. But I thought I'd let you know that Ros Ballister says she agrees with you about Pope. Coming back to this form thing, that patterning and form isn't always on the side of authority and control and power. We mustn't hand that and craft over to the forces of conservatism. And then I think I'm going to leave it really with someone.
Can I just?
Of course you can,
add to that and echo that point, because Ros is absolutely right, and that was part of Jane and I's impulse in actually creating the book and commissioning who we commissioned. And at the front of the book, Will Harris, another one of our brilliant poets, his essay, which is called Against Craft, precisely explores that issue more. And it's something that Jane and I feel strongly about, because craft, quote unquote, has often been used as code, as a way of excluding writers, of excluding poets who don't necessarily fit a certain stereotype, who come from a performance or spoken word background, to be told that the work is not well crafted for the stage. And it is politically loaded. I say small p politically loaded in my foreword, but it is there, absolutely. And part of hopefully what the book starts to do is to unpick that, unravel that, and suggest that, that the ideas of craft are much wider than we might give recognition to in the 21st century, in terms of what you as a working writer, working poet need to, to thrive. And so hence why considerations of truth, considerations of reality, considerations of using documentary evidence, using different dialects, idioms, and all that sort of stuff as well. Sorry, I jumped in.
No, it's great. It's just it's fantastic, and there's lots of questions. But how much do you read? How much do you write? How do you find your voice? It's really triggering a lot of thought and inspiration and thanks, and that's fantastic. But I think I'll finish with someone who says, Rishi is wicked, that's all. I had to hashtag fangirl. So you've got at least one fangirl there. So in fact, a lot more than that. So Thank you very much, Rishi. It really has been a fascinating evening and worth another hour and a bit on Zoom. I really feel invigorated, and thank you very much, everyone who's joined us. We really like, one of the things that we are pleased about with having things on Zoom is that it does enable a lot of people to come who might not make it to the physical Mansfield. And even when we go back to physical lectures, I'm sure we will be streaming them and trying to reach out in that way, because we do like to share some of the fantastic and inspiring thoughts and people we have here, including Rishi. So if you are interested, do please sign up for what's happening next term, and by all means send me ideas. I'm always looking for people who might be inspiring. I found Rishi by accident when he volunteered to speak at a careers evening for us, and I just am very pleased I did. So please do encourage the serendipity. Next week, oh yes, I think the chat, somebody has just put in the chat where all the next term's talks will be. If you do want to sign up next week, we have something which last year, again, we did live as a kind of salon evening, Mansfieldness, which our honorary fellow Erilyn Wallen, who's a fantastic composer, and Ben Ockery are curating. And it's all sorts of people reading or playing music. We've just put it together online. You can sign up for that if you want to, and it'll be about half an hour or 45 minutes at 5:30 next Friday. And then after that, we'll have a break until next term, and we will have a fantastic dance card, talk card, whatever it may be, next term as well. So thank you very much, Rishi. That was brilliant. And thank you all very much for joining us and your fantastic questions and comments. And please do read the Forward Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize and Caleb Femi and Rishi, and join the Poetry Book Society and try your own stuff, because it's fun. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Good night.